Did you know there's a war that's technically still going on today? A conflict that drew in over 20 countries, reshaped the world map, and set the stage for the Cold War as we know it, yet many people call it the Forgotten War. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the Korean War, a story of staggering courage, immense sacrifice, and a legacy that echoes to this very day. It's June 25th, 1950. Imagine the pre-dawn quiet along the 38th parallel, the line dividing North and South Korea. Suddenly, that quiet is shattered by the roar of artillery. Nearly 100,000 North Korean soldiers, backed by Soviet tanks, surge across the border. Their goal? To unify the peninsula under communist rule, and to do it quickly. The world, still healing from World War II, is caught completely off guard. The South Korean army, ill-equipped and outnumbered, is in full retreat. The capital, Seoul, falls in just 3 days. It looked like the end. But why was Korea divided in the first place? Let's rewind 5 years. In 1945, as World War II ended, Japan's 35-year colonial rule over Korea collapsed. The victorious Allies, specifically the Soviet Union and the United States, stepped in. They decided to temporarily divide the country at the 38th parallel for administrative purposes. The Soviets would oversee the North and the Americans the South. But temporary turned into permanent. The Cold War was just beginning to chill, and this ideological divide froze solid. In the North, Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla leader, established a communist state with Soviet backing. In the South, the U.S. supported the fiercely anti-communist Syngman Rhee, establishing the Republic of Korea. 2 Koreas, 2 ideologies, both claiming to be the one true government of the entire peninsula. The stage was set for a collision. Back to 1950, the invasion of South Korea sent shockwaves through the West. President Harry Truman saw this not just as a regional conflict, but as the first major test of the free world against communist expansion. He feared a domino effect. If South Korea fell, would Japan be next? Then Southeast Asia? He couldn't let it happen. Without a formal declaration of war, Truman committed U.S. forces and successfully lobbied the newly formed United Nations to intervene. For the first time in history, an international coalition, a UN command led by the United States, was assembled to repel an aggressor. Troops and support from 21 countries, including the UK, Canada, Australia, and Turkey, began pouring into the region. The conflict had just gone global. The UN forces, mostly American at this point, arrived to a desperate situation. They were pushed back all the way to a small pocket of land in the southeast corner of the peninsula, a defensive line that became known as the Pusan Perimeter. For 6 brutal weeks, they held on by a thread, fighting a desperate battle of survival against relentless North Korean attacks. It seemed like they were about to be driven into the sea. The fate of South Korea, and perhaps the world, hung in the balance. Then came the masterstroke. General Douglas MacArthur, the charismatic and controversial Supreme Commander of the UN forces, proposed a plan so audacious, so risky, it was almost dismissed as impossible. He wanted to bypass the front line and launch a massive amphibious assault behind enemy lines at Incheon, a port city with treacherous tides and heavily fortified defenses. Military planners were horrified. The risks were astronomical. But MacArthur insisted. On September 15, 1950, under the cover of naval bombardment, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Incheon. It was a staggering success. The North Korean army, caught completely by surprise, saw their supply lines severed. Their front at the Pusan perimeter collapsed. The UN forces broke out, retook Seoul, and began a rapid advance north. The momentum had completely shifted. It was one of the most brilliant military maneuvers in modern history. The war seemed all but won. MacArthur, emboldened by the victory, convinced Truman to allow his forces to cross the 38th parallel and unify Korea under a democratic government. The goal was no longer just to save South Korea, but to liberate the North. As UN troops pushed towards the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, a new colossal player was watching with growing alarm. China's new communist leader, Mao Zedong, had repeatedly issued warnings through diplomatic channels. Do not approach our border. But these warnings were largely dismissed by MacArthur as a bluff. He was confident China would not dare to intervene. He was tragically mistaken. In late October 1950, what MacArthur's troops thought were just a few volunteer Chinese soldiers turned out to be a terrifying reality. Mao had secretly sent hundreds of thousands of troops, a people's volunteer army, pouring across the Yalu River. They were battle-hardened, accustomed to the harsh terrain and freezing winters. UN forces, spread thin and unprepared for this new enemy, were ambushed in the icy mountains of North Korea. The fighting was savage. At places like the Chosin Reservoir, U.S. Marines found themselves surrounded and outnumbered, fighting a heroic but desperate retreat in temperatures that plunged to 30 below zero. They called themselves the Chosin Few. The massive Chinese intervention triggered the longest retreat in U.S. military history. Seoul, which had been liberated just months earlier, fell once again to the communist forces. The war had taken a dramatic and bloody turn. The initial optimism of a quick victory was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a brutal, grinding conflict. General MacArthur, furious and humiliated, publicly called for an expansion of the war, including blockading China and even using nuclear weapons. This put him in direct conflict with President Truman, who feared such actions would ignite a full-blown World War III with both China and the Soviet Union. The disagreement became irreconcilable. In a move that stunned the world, Truman fired the legendary General MacArthur for insubordination. By the summer of 1951, the war had settled into a brutal stalemate, with the front lines congealing roughly back around the 38th parallel, the same line where it all began. The next 2 years were a war of attrition. Instead of grand maneuvers, it became a bloody, static conflict of trench warfare, artillery duels, and vicious battles for strategic hills with names like Pork Chop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a hellish existence of mud, cold, and constant fear. Peace talks began in July 1951, but they dragged on for 2 excruciating years, stalled by disagreements over prisoner exchanges and the final demarcation line. While diplomats argued, soldiers continued to fight and die. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. Not a peace treaty, but a ceasefire. The guns fell silent. The agreement established the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, a heavily fortified buffer zone near the 38th parallel that still separates North and South Korea today. The war was over, but the conflict was not. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war. So what was the legacy of this forgotten war? The human cost was immense. Nearly 5 million people perished, the majority of them Korean civilians. The entire peninsula was devastated. For the world, the Korean War fundamentally changed the Cold War. It militarized the conflict, transforming it from a political and economic struggle into a global military standoff. It led to a massive increase in U.S. defense spending and the expansion of NATO. It cemented the division of Korea, creating one of the world's most tense and militarized borders, a wound that remains unhealed. Today, South Korea has blossomed into a vibrant democracy and a global economic powerhouse. North Korea remains one of the most isolated and repressive regimes in the world. The DMZ is a stark reminder of this war's enduring legacy, a scar on the map and a symbol of a family divided. The Korean War may be forgotten by many, but for the Korean people and the veterans who fought there, its memory is etched in pain and sacrifice. It is a crucial chapter of our modern history that reminds us how quickly lines on a map can become battlefronts and how the echoes of conflict can last for generations. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into history. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.